Today, I want to talk about stress and how it relates to turnover in policing. Policing is currently experiencing a legitimacy crisis, and in the 21st century, officers are operating in a completely different environment. According to the Pew Research Center, most officers say that high profile incidents between the police and people of color have made their job a lot harder. They say that interactions with people of color have become much more intense, and perhaps out of fear for becoming the next viral video, officers feel that other officers in the department seem to be reluctant to use force, even in situations where it would be deemed appropriate. Even more, they also perceive that their fellow officers have become less proactive in their efforts to stop and question people who seem suspicious. And despite no empirical evidence suggesting that there is a war on cops or even an increase in targeted efforts to harm the police, most officers say that they are more concerned about their personal safety than ever before. In a simple glance at the headlines, it seems that turnover is becoming a huge issue in policing. You have officers that are calling in sick to work, also known as the blue flu, or simply officers are just resigning or leaving the profession completely. And it begs the question of whether we are currently experiencing a mass exodus in policing. To be sure, the feds analyze data from the Law Enforcement Management and Administrative Statistics, as well as the Census of state and local law enforcement agencies, to show that prior to Ferguson, the national turnover rate for officers was around 11%, and most of which was voluntary turnover from resignations or officers retiring. Even in that study, it showed that rates of turnover were not universal across police departments. Officers are significantly more likely to leave their departments when they work for smaller agencies or agencies that have less than 50 full-time sworn police officers. They're also more likely to leave when they work for municipal versus state, federal, or even county agencies, and especially if the agency is in the South or in a rural area. And while some reformers are proponents of turnover in policing can actually be a detriment to the communities in which the agencies serve. And not only that, it can also be a detriment to the agency itself, most of which because whether we are talking about training to retirement, officers are extremely expensive to hire. In fact, most of the budget for policing is actually allocated to personnel. In an analysis of officers with the Chicago PD, they found that the cost of losing one officer ranges anywhere from 1 to 5 times the salary of that officer, which in some cases can be up to $150,000 per officer. And research has also found that voluntary turnover, or when officers leave agencies on their own without getting fired, is actually associated with increased rates of violent and property crime. In addition to direct costs, we also have to talk about indirect costs, which is a little bit more challenging to really tap into. But indirect costs also matter because when you have turnover, that can actually translate into lower productivity among officers who are also thinking about quitting. And turnover can place more pressure on remaining employees to pick up the slack or cover more shifts. Agencies also lose valuable information from officers who've worked on cases for a long time or have built strong bonds with confidential informants, and some studies have even shown that turnover can create a contagion effect where all it takes is one officer to leave, and that results in a waterfall of other officers coming to the realization of either leaving that agency and or the profession overall. To date, evidence of the effects of the recent high-profile incidents post-Ferguson is actually limited. In a recent 2021 study, Scott Mortigos and friends analyzed 60 months of employment data from a large police department in the western United States. And they did this to examine turnover following protests after George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer. And so, compared to the months leading up to the murder of George Floyd, voluntary resignations increased almost 300% after the summer protests. And so, although this stems from a single police department in the Western United States, it speaks to the growing issue agencies face in ensuring that there are enough quality officers to protect and serve communities. And so, to understand why officers are leaving their organizations, Adam Matz and colleagues conducted a meta-analysis of 13 studies to identify the strongest predictors of turnover among police across the United States. And what they found was that actually looking for another job was the strongest predictor across studies. So if officers are even opening up the Indeed app or have put fillers out there about potential job openings, they're more likely to leave. And officers are also likely to leave when they have lower job satisfaction. So they don't necessarily like their job or the people that they work with. Also related to burnout, especially when they are emotionally exhausted. Other factors related to officers who struggle to deal with stress or cope with the distressing aspects of police work, like constant exposure to death or injuries or even crimes against children. And finally, officers are also more likely to leave when they feel like the policies and procedures within the organization are either unfair or biased. So, to address issues with turnover, agencies have to be proactive in improving the work environment, not only to improve job satisfaction, but to also improve perceptions of fairness among their officers, help them to reduce burnout, and provide resources so officers can manage stress and be able to cope effectively with the distressing aspects that are inherently part of police work. And so, to learn more about these factors and what agencies can do, check out my other videos on job satisfaction, vicarious trauma, and burnout in policing.